Welcome back, everyone, to our Fireside chat with Minister Bowinn Ma. Many of you are familiar with Minister Ma. She's been a staple at our conferences, but also a staple in the Canadian landscape around climate action, transportation innovation, and generally public transit across British Columbia. Minister Ma is British Columbia's Minister of State for Infrastructure and the MLA for North Vancouver Lonsdale. And I'm going to take a moment, Minister Ma, just to introduce you a bit by your bio, because it's really relevant to the dialogue we've been having here this week about rail innovation as a way to move Canadians for climate action. Minister Ma has been an advocate for environmentally sustainable transportation for many years, and many of you know her from her portfolios in the past. She did lead the first ever feasibility study for rapid transit across Burrard Inlet, and was and continues to guide the regional transportation planning for all levels of government on the North Shore. As Minister of State for Infrastructure, Minister Ma works with the Honourable Rob Fleming, Minister of Transportation and Infrastructure, to deliver many of those major transportation projects that we've all been watching in the news. They include the Broadway Subway Project, the Surrey-Langley SkyTrain Project, the Pattullo Bridge Replacement Project, George Massey Crossing Replacement Project, and Highway 1 Fraser Valley Corridor Improvement Program. So lots of infrastructure in a country where we know we have an infrastructure debt. We're going to focus in on rail mobility, and the ability of rail to address climate change here today. So welcome, Minister Ma. And again, as a segue, I mean, your historical experience as Parliamentary Secretary for TransLink is something that we're going to dive into a little bit here today. So welcome to the discussion today and to our conference.
Oh, thank you so much for having me.
It's a real pleasure. And so I'm going to jump into the questions right away. One of the questions that a lot of us kind of have a burning knowledge to know is around your role now as British Columbia's Minister of State for Infrastructure. You have a lot of direct personal experience working on major construction projects. And this comes from your experience, as a project engineer at the Vancouver International Airport. And also, I think, from your previous portfolio experience as the Parliamentary Secretary for TransLink up until last year. So that's a lot of personal technical experience. Can you take us through how important those experiences have been and how they've helped to shape your vision of the future of rail transportation in British Columbia?
Thank you so much for that question. For better or for worse, I feel like I'm able to appreciate the complexities behind major construction projects because of my involvement in them in the past, but also that I'm able to see the opportunities as well. Coming from the airport authority, I've had the benefit of working with an organization that had notoriously high standards when it came to what we expected from the contractors that we hired. And I've seen that it can, in fact, be done at that high standard. And at the same time, though, major projects like the ones that you've listed aren't simple, and a successful outcome depends heavily on the parts of a project that the public tends to pay a lot less attention to. And for instance, the way that it's scoped out, the way that it's set up. And the benefit to the public, I think, of having someone who has an experience as Parliamentary Secretary for TransLink, now working the role that I have today, is a very deliberate embrace of a multimodal approach as the way forward for the region. And with most of the projects that come out of the Ministry of Transportation and Infrastructure being related to the province's vast and important highway network, the opportunities for multimodal integration might be less obvious ones. And I know that, as you noted earlier, it comes as no surprise to anyone who knows me that I strongly believe in integrated multimodal approaches to transportation. However, I will acknowledge that as a deficit in my experience coming out of some very Metro Vancouver centric experience, I wasn't certain what this kind of approach would mean to more rural or remote communities until I started talking to colleagues who represented those kinds of communities. And I suppose I had expected them to tell me what a lot of people often assume, which is that, oh, those communities are so heavily car dependent and there's no interest in these other low carbon forms of transportation like transit, rail trails, walking infrastructure. But that's not actually what they ended up telling me. Instead, they described enabling alternative modes of transportation as a matter of social equity for those who cannot afford or are otherwise incapable of owning or operating a car, their own car, and as also a matter of livability, particularly as a way to attract much needed professionals like doctors from the city who expect a different standard of life based on where they come from. So it's all been a very eye-opening experience.
I think that is fascinating. You touch on a couple real important points about diversity. I mean, look, we just came out of Canada's first National Reconciliation Day, and there are Indigenous communities throughout British Columbia that are not connected. And that's the same story for all of Canada, to be frank. So it's really interesting that, that perhaps public mobility and public transit, as well as multimodal mobility, is a social equity thing. I think it's a feminist issue. I think it's an issue for Indigenous rights. And it's an issue for the safety of people, right? So a real motivator there. If I may, Minister, then I'm going to go into a couple of the projects that really could transform the way people live. Now, it does swing the pendulum a little bit back to the urban environment, but asking you some questions now about SkyTrain line, which is such a hot topic. That SkyTrain line through Surrey and into Langley is very popular through BC's Lower Mainland, which is a great story for Canadians. It's really encouraging, I think, that in July we heard the federal government say, here's $1.3 billion for this really important project. But since that time, we've had a federal election. There's been a lot of discussion about, recovery and about pandemic budgets and about how we're going to manage all these infrastructure spends. Can you give us an update in terms of the next steps of what you expect to see in the next few months for that project? And if it does move forward in the way expected, what does it really mean for the quality of life of British Columbians?
Yeah, so the announcement in July of up to $1.3 billion in federal funding for the full Surrey-Langley SkyTrain extension was a really big step forward for this project. And absolutely, this project is going to happen. We already have the work underway. Now, a little bit of history on this project. It originally started as part of TransLink's and Mayor's Council's 10-year transportation plan for the Metro Vancouver region. But last year, the province assumed responsibility for the project from TransLink, which at the time was planning to build the line in 2 phases, with the first phase stopping midway through Surrey and the second phase going out to Langley. Rather than doing it in 2 phases, we're going to be delivering the project as one 16-kilometer long line that will take the Surrey-Langley SkyTrain all the way through Fleetwood to Langley City. And using this single project approach will speed up completion, we anticipate, by about 2 years. So moving up the full completion date from 2030 up to 2028. We also expect it will result in some cost savings as well, costing about $500 million less than building it in 2 stages. So once completed, travelers will be able to expect to go from King George SkyTrain station to Langley Centre in about 22 minutes. So this project is progressing nicely. We're working to confirm technical work, environmental conditions, and Indigenous and public engagements for the province to deliver the entire line to Langley. We're also looking at ways that we can utilize and leverage this project in order to influence some of the land use planning around this project as well. I think a lot of your conference goers will know that building a line in and of itself does not necessarily result in fewer cars on the road, in more sustainable travel. You also need to be building the community around it to support that kind of transit. So the transit-oriented development work, we will have to continue to work with the municipalities on. Additionally, I will note as well, in terms of progress, people who live in the area may notice that advanced work to relocate utilities along the Fraser Highway is already underway. So the city of Surrey is widening sections of Fraser Highway and doing it in a way that will accommodate the future guideway for our project. I should note as well that while the project's preliminary budget is just under $4 billion, the final costs have yet to be finalized. And so we're actively building out a business case right now in order to get a more accurate estimate on that work. And we'll continue to work closely with local governments, Indigenous groups, TransLink, and the Mayor's Councils, all the usual partners that our government has become very familiar with working with on this major project. My hope is that this project will provide sustainable transportation choices across the region, not just for people who live in Surrey and Langley, but for people who work there as well, because a lot of the people who live here in Metro Vancouver know that you don't always live in the places where you work, and having cleaner, more environmentally, more socially friendly options for travel helps people make the easy choice to leave their cars at home.
Yeah, Minister, like I can't stand driving. I'm a bad driver to start, and when I sit behind the wheel of a car, I'm an even worse driver. At least I admit it. I think most people are bad drivers, but at least I admit it. And the only other place where I've literally wanted to bash my head like into the dashboard is trying to get out of Vancouver. I mean, there's the QEW in Toronto, and then there's getting out of Vancouver. And the few times I have made the very foolish mistake of not taking the train and trying to drive, you watch the SkyTrain above you moving ahead, and you think that's the way it's got to be. So no wonder it is so popular. We have entire panels here at the conference around that build out around rail stations that you've been talking about. And it is this generational change of wanting to live and work and have retail in life around those rail stations. So bringing kind of the soul to that rail network. On that front, then, if we turn our attention over to another popular rail project in British Columbia, it's that Canada Line expansion from Arbutus eventually over to University of British Columbia. And there were many days as a poor student that I was trying to make my way out to UBC campus for a conference, and that is one epic bus ride. So, getting a train out there would just be brilliant. Can I pass it to you for you to give us an update on that construction work, what's happening, the tunneling, is it starting, and really how close are we to getting a train to UBC?
Yeah, and I appreciate your anecdote because I'm very familiar with that epic bus ride as well. I think I learned during university how I can actually sleep in almost any condition. I think I was once caught sleeping on the floor of the bus on the way to UBC. So I completely understand why the concept of having a rapid transit connection, fixed rail rapid transit connection out to UBC is so popular. Now, the work that we're undergoing on the Broadway subway project right now runs 5.7 kilometers from BCC Clark Station to Broadway and Arbutus, and that adds about 6 underground stations along the line. We marked the official start of major construction in May, and now we have activities construction activity at all 6 sites. There's been a lot happening over the last few months, and there will be a lot happening over the next few months as well. But having said that, we're using traffic decking to keep people and businesses and travel moving throughout this busy corridor during construction. We describe it in terms of the type of construction we're doing it. We describe it as cover and cut as opposed to cut and cover. We're covering it, and then we're going to go underneath, and then we're going to excavate. Now, the installation of the first traffic deck at the future Mount Pleasant station began in October, and we anticipate the completion of the final traffic deck at the future Arbutus station next year. We're also gearing up for the construction of a 700-meter long elevated guideway portion, which is essentially a ramp that will extend from the above ground BCC Clark Station and lead into the tunnel portion of the new line. Now, you mentioned tunneling. Is the tunneling starting? Is the boring starting? We've got 2 tunnel boring machines scheduled to arrive summer of next year, so mid-2022. And they will be boring for about 1 full year. Simultaneously, we've got 2 machines coming. I understand that it is tradition to name those tunnel boring machines, and I really look forward to those opportunities. I hazard to suggest that we go to the public for suggestions on names, because I do remember the infamous Bodie McBodie face.
Oh, right.
That. So I don't know if we're going to go that route, but it is an interesting opportunity.
Mm-hmm.
Now, your question, though, was about how do we get Arbutus, the Broadway subway project from Arbutus all the way out to UBC, because Arbutus stops a bit short of UBC. So the future extension to UBC was featured in the recent Transport 2050 long-term planning document that TransLink released just a few weeks ago. And it is identified in phase 2 of the regional mayor's 10-year vision for exploration. And that 10-year vision is what we are implementing right now. So a jointly funded business case is being developed or will be developed, and that's being funded by senior levels of government as well as some funding at the local level. And in the meantime, I can absolutely confirm that the design of the new Arbutus station will allow for a future extension. And so we've got to go through the steps for the future UBC line, which we know is, we call UBCX, UBC extension line. But for now, we're really focused on finishing that line up to Arbutus.
I have absolutely no doubt that once that extension happens in the future, there will be loads of conferences out there because there's actually a way to get out there a little bit more effectively. But, maybe you should go to the public for names, because at least at minimum, we might get more anti-colonial, kind of historically aware names from a democratic perspective. So I'll put that one out there. But really exciting.
I will also say, I mean, the tunnel boring machines will only be here for a year. So if we do end up with, Boring McBoring Face as a name, it won't last forever, right?
That's right. And I can tell you, did you call it cover and cut, that process? I think there's a few places in downtown Toronto where people would have appreciated that kind of methodology. So it's very interesting to hear. With that, and knowing we don't have a huge amount of time, I do want to extract a little bit of last information about another rail project. It's just there's so much rail happening in British Columbia and not enough rail in all of Canada. So we're going to extract that information to the extent we can. That is the introduction of the rail line to the Fraser Valley. Is this a pipe dream? Is it possible? Is it something that's realistic in our lifetimes and realistic as part of the climate action to 2050 goal? Is that something that's feasible from your perspective?
Yeah, I mean, I assume you're asking the question from beyond the Surrey-Langley SkyTrain line, which does, of course, go partway through the Fraser Valley. But the concept of rail or commuter rail in particular out through the Fraser Valley is a topic that actually came up in our 2020 speech from the throne. And it was one of the items identified in my mandate letter from the Premier, which was to help advance planning to support the expansion or the concept of rail up to the Fraser Valley. So since the appointment of Minister Fleming and I to Transportation and Infrastructure last year, we've been working really hard with the public service to change the way that we approach transportation projects throughout the province and making deliberate efforts to actually integrate development and land use principles into the kinds of transportation projects we deliver. And that also means taking into account things like population and job growth, understanding local community plans and demographic shifts in the region, where people are going to, where people are moving to or moving from, and taking into account as well all of the ways that people travel. So one of those ways that people travel could be by rail. And there's certainly a lot of talk about the possibilities that exist out in the valley. I have to say it's still early days for any specific rail projects that could come out of this, but we do want to make sure that the infrastructure that we build today takes into account potential expansion later on. So for instance, we're currently working on multimodal improvements to Highway 1, the corridor between 264th Street and Whatcom Way. And as this project moves forward, we're going to be making sure that it won't preclude any future development of mass transit, including options such as light rail. And of course, we're going to want to make sure that we're doing all of this in collaboration with Fraser Valley local governments, because especially, well, I mean, I only have BC experience. I assume that it's similar across Canada, but local governments hold a lot of the tools with respect to land use planning. And if we're not coordinating provincially delivered projects with what the local land use plans are, then we could potentially be making things worse. We need to be working hand in hand, in step together as we move forward.
Yeah, that's a great segue to the final question. I mean, often we hear in Canada that cities are just babies of the province, and so they don't have a lot of constitutional leverage or ability to negotiate. But actually, land use is the foundation of transportation. So there is a lot of power and control there. Great to hear that there's a lot of engagement. And I'm going to then shift to the segue you made there about making sure that that land use in those expansions has room for transit in it in the future. We're coming out of a pandemic, knock on wood, we hope, if vaccination rates stay as high as they are and keep going. And yet we still haven't had the return to transit that we've seen, that we had pre-pandemic. And we knew even pre-pandemic, we needed more people in transit to address climate change, not fewer. So can you walk us through just all of the rail expansions, but also public transit and mobility, and your reading of the tea leaves as an expert? What is happening in British Columbia, and what's the hope in terms of getting people back into transit as part of climate action, including critically rail, which moves more people over a larger distance faster and more efficiently than any other mode?
Yeah, I mean, I wouldn't call myself an expert. It's more that I listen and learn from a lot of different experts and analyze what it is that I'm hearing. So I'll do my best there. I will say that, I mean, the pandemic has really impacted ridership on transit across the globe. It's not a BC or a Canada or even a North America specific issue. And while it is true that we haven't seen 100% recovery yet, what we do know for sure is that public transit will continue to be an extremely important part of our economy, of our social structure, of our from a social equity perspective, and even as a social program. So for instance, when the pandemic hit, our government made the very deliberate choice to invest literally hundreds and hundreds of millions of dollars to keep BC Transit and TransLink public transit services operating at pre-pandemic levels throughout the entire pandemic, even though ridership dropped. And we did that because of a few reasons. One is that we know that once you really lose frequency and reliability, once people stop trusting public transit, it takes a lot to get them to build up again. And we've spent a lot of, we've invested a lot, money, of course, but time, energy, we've worked really hard as a society to build up our public transit system here in British Columbia. And we were not about to let a pandemic ruin all of that progress into the future. But the other reason why we did it is because the people who continued to use public transit tended to be essential workers that we all were relying on. They tended to be amongst our poorest paid workers, sadly. They often also meant that there were a lot of women, people of color, a lot of disadvantaged groups who did not have the opportunity or the choice to just hop back into their car in order to get around if transit stopped. And so it was incredibly important for us to maintain that. And we know that moving forward, that will continue to be an incredibly important way that people travel. Now, I would also say that it has to be an important way that people travel. Our government just released today, or rather earlier this month, the Clean BC Roadmap to 2030. And the Clean BC Roadmap to 2030 identifies how we are going to hit our 2030 emissions reduction targets. In British Columbia, about 40% of all the GHG emissions that we have to track come from transportation. And we have targets that are very, very aggressive, including major mode shifts. So we want by 2030 for 25% of all trips in the entire province to be made by public transit or active transportation. And also, perhaps even more aggressively, a target to actively reduce the number of vehicle kilometers driven. So by 2030, we want for there to be 25% fewer vehicle kilometers driven in comparison to 2020. There are not very many ways that I can think of accomplishing that if we don't have a strong public transit system. But public transit won't be the only solution for that. In addition to investments in active transportation, we're also going to have to take a very, very serious look at land use planning as well. How do we build homes close to jobs, close to schools, close to childcare, close to grocery stores, so that you don't have to drive 10 kilometers to pick up a jug of milk? Those are the kinds of decisions that we're going to have to make over the next few months, few years, and well into the future if we're going to want to actually meet our climate reduction targets.
It's an excellent concluding point. I mean, I'll be frank, you're a woman in a leadership role. You've got the brains, the talent. You're doing what you need to do to transform the country. As a woman in a leadership role myself, I mean, look at Mayor like Anne Hidalgo in Paris trying to make it that 15-minute city. It is clear based on what you said, women were hammered during the pandemic as nurses, as teachers, as low-wage income earners. Their transit is the lifeline of the economics of their household. So it's got to be there. And then to your point, it's got to be better. We got to get cars off the road. And I have every faith, Minister Ma, that you are one of the right people to make that happen, most certainly in British Columbia, but also as a Canadian. I think we have a lot to learn from the leadership that you've shown on this file and that you continue to show on the file. So I want to thank you for your insights, for your comments. It's given us all hope. I know all of us who are rail buffs are looking to BC for a lot of leadership. With a population of 5 million, I mean, it's definitely leading the rail dialogue, and other provinces a lot of work to catch up. So thank you so much again, Minister Ma, for your time. And I know that our colleagues and our participants at this conference have a great deal of appreciation for everything you've done. Again, everyone, a round of appreciation on behalf of the board of directors and the members of CUTRIC, as well as the participants here today, to Minister Bowinn Ma, who is British Columbia's Minister of State for Infrastructure. Thank you again, Minister Ma.